Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome back for quite a number of you. And if you're new here, then welcome for this evening's event as well. Just to introduce myself, if you are new here, I'm James Kelly, and I'm the Sweeting Associate Professor in the History of Catholicism at Durham, and lead the History of Catholicism research strand within the University's Centre for Catholic Studies. And what we're going to do tonight is move on from where we were yesterday. I'm actually going to start by talking about a couple of messages that came in that I said I was going to hang over for today, like a threat perhaps for some people. But just before we do, just a couple of housekeeping things. That everybody should hopefully be muted, and you shouldn't be able to get round it, but hopefully it'll keep it that way. So if you could please keep it that way, that would be great. Now, in the chat function, there's going to be a couple of things posted by Liam, who's going to be talking tonight, and that will just be some Twitter handles for the speakers we've got tonight and yesterday's, if you want to follow them, and also my email if you want to contact me at all. So he'll post them a couple of times in the chat during the evening, but they're there for you to check. Now, just in terms of questions, what we're going to do, we were going to try something yesterday, it didn't quite work out, so we're going to stick with what actually happened, which is if you could message your questions to me for the speakers, okay, in the chat function. As I said, please include your name so that I can say who it's come from rather than iPad 6 or something like that. And then I will read out the questions. I'll select a few that we'll put to the speakers, and we'll aim to get maybe 2 or 3 done for each of them. Although some people won't have questions, I'll explain why when we come to them, okay? And that's really just the housekeeping matters for tonight. And we're going to hear from a series of speakers. As I said, I want to start actually just a couple of reflections for myself of a couple of comments that came in. And that was yesterday. There was some discussion about what should be kept for archives and what's important for historians and scholars. And from Barbara sent to me that she was mentioning the annals of most religious orders are really enlightening. They definitely are. They're a great source. And that one set that she's consulted, you can see the annalist records all the people who passed through the convent door. And this often included sisters going to make foundations or far-flung countries and various bishops and so on. So that's one source where you can get a great deal of material from. What I would say are also things like necrologies or obituary books. And I can remember looking at one of these in particular. I'm not going to say what community it was. And obituary books, for those who aren't used to them, were always used in the early modern period for a way that you would perhaps read them, or they'd be read at special occasions for you to know the lineage that you were entering in the community. And there was just one entrance for one nun who I felt really sorry for. And I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, and I'm going to change her name as well because I feel very sorry for her. And it said that Sister Bridget one day heard a knocking at the door. And the next line said she opened the door and there was a small child there who she patted on the head. The next line then said the child dropped dead instantly. And the final line just said Sister Bridget was never allowed to open the door or talk to children again. And I always feel immensely sorry for this poor nun, because that's how she was remembered. She might have done all sorts of other things, but that was the memory that was there. But it shows you just different stories that you can get from various sources. And then just to move on and link to that is a message we had from Sister Hannah Rita, a Dominican, who was saying about it's not only important about what to keep, but also what to produce. And this is a really good point. And that their community has started to document some of the motivations, hopes and doubts leading to decisions that they're making, and including to keep some of the letters. We're quite lucky in the early modern period, we do have letters, but it's become a bit scarcer later on. And this has always reminded me when we talk about this is one of the great things that you can get, and that we always talk about historians, you hear it on television a lot, is alive with religious communities. And I was very lucky to go and visit the Carmelite community that was in Darlington until recently, that was founded in Lierre in the mid-17th century. I can remember then being shown the profession book by one of the nuns, Sister Kathleen, and she showed me the very first profession in the 1640s. Then she whizzed through the book and she said, and there's me. Now that's a phenomenal idea for a sense of history. And we hear that term all the time about living history. You know, you hear it said on television, in newspapers and things, but there it is. And so that's another thing that I would say, linking to what's being said there, is that this is living history we're talking about, and we're missing that trick there. So it may be that we can talk, maybe at some point, someone might mention things like oral histories as a really important source to begin making sure we have a record of these things. But as I said, even just in those archives, you can see that living history that's going on there. So that's just a few ideas just to start today as we now move on. And today we're first going to hear from Dr. Hannah Thomas, who I'll mention in a minute, who's going to be introduced by Sister Frances Orchard of the Congregation of Jesus. Then after we've had the breakout rooms, which I'll tell you a little bit about when we come to them, we're going to hear from 3 speakers. We're going to have Sister Scholastica Jacob, Dr. Liam Temple, and Professor John McCafferty is going to conclude for us today. So the first speaker that we're going to have, as I said, is Dr. Hannah Thomas, who was mentioned a bit yesterday because she's effectively had 2 hats to go through. And that's that she was with the Centre for Catholic Studies and was the first Sepulchrine fellow, so the first person working with the Canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre. And she was working on their cemetery in Death and Dying, which I'm sure she'll talk about more. But after leaving the Centre for Catholic Studies, Hannah's become Special Collections Manager for the Congregation of Jesus, the English province, and is based at the Bar Convent. And I'm going to hand over to Sister Frances from the Congregation of Jesus to introduce Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. It's really a great pleasure for me to be asked to introduce Dr. Hannah Thomas as this evening's guest speaker on Hidden Histories. She's doing her best to make us less hidden. And those of you who read the Daily Telegraph or the Yorkshire newspapers might have seen a lovely article on Hannah in last week's edition. And there she was, head down in the antique library at the Bar Convent, poring over documents and trying to make us less hidden. As James has just said, Hannah's role at the Bar Convent is Special Collections and Research Manager for the Congregation of Jesus and based at the Bar Convent. And she came to us through the CCS and through the Canonesses, so it's very much a sort of family occasion today. Hiddenness is actually part of our culture, or at least it was until Hannah came on board in 2017. Without hiddenness, our 16th century Yorkshire foundress, Mary Ward, would never have been able to found a congregation. Working in London, she was busy supporting the work of the recusant priests. She moved around in secret, often in disguise, and communicated by code. A few decades later, when the Bar Convent was founded in 1686, the penal laws forbade the establishment of religious houses. They also forbade the education of children, and there we were doing both. We had to keep hidden. Therefore, the 18th century chapel at the Bar Convent cannot be seen from outside the building. And we didn't know for 100 years or so that there was actually a priest's hole there. It was discovered when the chapel was last renovated. I think hiddenness can become part of the unconscious culture of a congregation. It's said that if you had difficulty in your foundation, then you are likely to have the same sorts of difficulties as you go through life. And I think we did allow ourselves to become very hidden. The church would quite like us to become hidden. It didn't want too many women around, and particularly active women. And therefore, to survive, we had to conform. But it's taken the arrival of Hannah to open up our rich heritage of archives and our antique library with its 1,800 volumes, some of which are extremely rare. And we are very grateful to the CCS for helping us with the cataloguing of the antique library. Hannah has also reorganized and digitalized the collections, run seminars, symposia, set up pop exhibitions. I hope she'll tell you exactly what she's been up to. The only task she's not yet had time to do is to research the hidden history of the Bar Convent Sisters and the cemetery. And I mention that because this is the great work she has done, the Canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre in Chelmsford. And I hope that when Hannah has had time to do that research and produce, no doubt, a beautiful tome on the Bar Convent Cemetery, as she has for Canonesses, I will be invited again to introduce her. So Hannah, I'm delighted we're going to hear you tonight. I'm sure I'll learn things I didn't know. And thank you very much for coming to give this talk. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sister Francis and James, for those glowing introductions. I hope that what follows lives up to that. So as you've just heard, I'm Dr. Hannah Thomas. I'm the Special Collections Manager at the Bar Convent. And I was also the Sepulchrine postdoc fellow at the CCS from 2014 to 2017. So I want to begin today just by giving you a brief overview of my work with each community before moving on to look at the kind of nature and importance of religious archives and some of my findings more over the last few years. I'm just going to share my screen. It'll work. There you go. So as we heard from Moira yesterday, my project with the Sepulchrines focused particularly on their cemetery at Newhall in Essex, which you can see on the screen there, and then on convent cemeteries more generally. So the community knew that it was important to them as a community, as the final resting place of all members of the community who had died since 1799. But they wanted to find out what this meant more broadly. Was it historically significant? How should it best be maintained going forward? And why did it matter to the wider world? So as we heard yesterday, the Canonesses were founded in Liège in 1642 by Susan Hawley, where they remained until the French Revolution necessitated evacuation to England in 1794. So this cemetery was created soon after they arrived at Newhall in 1799. And my research was able to show that this was in fact the oldest Catholic cemetery in continuous use in England. And it's still in use by the community today. And as you just heard, my work at the CCS also led me to the Bar Convent. Initially as a researcher, I visited a few times as a researcher, and then later on via the various regular events, which helped to foster such excellent close working relationships between the CCS and their supporters. So since September 2017, I've been based at the Bar Convent in York, working as the Special Collections Manager and Research Fellow. So the Bar Convent was founded in 1686, as you just heard, by Sister Frances Bedingfield, who you can see at the top left there, and has been owned, occupied and used by Mary Ward's Institute continuously since that date. So you can see at the top right there what the convent looked like when they took possession in 1686. And the bottom middle image is what it looks like today. So both the Bar Convent and the community's convent at Hammersmith in London, which was established in 1669, included schools for girls, and they're thought to be the earliest schools for girls in the country. So I'll return to the history of the community itself in a minute, but just to give you a brief overview of the job. So it's a busy and varied job, as you might imagine. No 2 days are the same, but broadly, I look after the archives, library and objects of the Congregation of Jesus. And I'm cataloguing them to recognisable international standards, encouraging researchers and academics to use the collections, in some cases even making them aware that they existed in the first place, and making the archives and library more visible to the general public, many of whom might be familiar with our sort of cafe, B&B, museum, or more kind of touristy destinations, but hadn't necessarily linked those with the global history of the CJs, and also continue in my own research. So the Institute, as I mentioned, was founded in 1609 by Mary Ward, who felt that she was being called to something quite different from what already existed. She was called to establish a community of unenclosed women religious, free to follow God's will and to go wherever they were needed, using the model of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, which had been founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540. So Ward wanted the same freedom and autonomy for her community, which to our modern sensibilities sounds quite reasonable. But at the time it was in direct contravention of the Church, which had recently commanded at the Council of Trent that, quote, no nun shall after her profession be permitted to go out of the monastery, even for a brief period under any pretext whatever. And this was also framed in terms of the safety of the convent. So the council also allowed a bishop to forcibly relocate a convent. So if it was isolated outside city walls or to within more populous areas to protect the nuns. So Mary Ward's radical vision and departure from this norm meant that the initial years for the community were fraught with difficulty and danger. So both from within the church itself, as I just outlined, and also in England, where the two houses in London and York were the only convents established in England after the religious changes ushered in by the Reformation. So despite this somewhat tumultuous start, the order recovered and continued to flourish and is currently active in 22 countries around the world. The sisters are closely linked with the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Loreto Sisters, who are similarly active in 23 countries, and between them they have a presence on every single continent. So having been known variously, you'll have noticed the different names we've already used. So they've been known as Mary Ward's Institute, the English Ladies, the Galloping Girls, the Jesuitesses, the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In 2004, Mary Ward's vision was finally realized. The full Ignatian constitutions were adopted, and the name of the order was changed to the Congregation of Jesus to reflect Mary Ward's desire that her congregation be known by the name of Jesus. So this rich and varied history is reflected in the archive material itself. So thus the inherently flexible character of the community and this internationally mobile structure and a deeply Ignatian charism did not result in the collection of material purely for posterity's sake. Indeed, it was not until the 1980s, following the closure of the school, or the handing over of the school, and a new phase in the use of the building, that a dedicated archive was properly established, thanks to the work of Sister Gregory Kirkus, who you can see here in the Antique Library. Much of the material that survives in the archives was therefore created for very practical purposes, which means that we have a somewhat patchy, somewhat organic amount of information, which gives a broad sense of the history of the house and the school and community, but is somewhat skewed in the version of the history it presents to the researcher. So for example, in the archive, we have a list of every single child who boarded at the school from 1710 until 1930. So hundreds of girls listed by name, with their parents listed, and the money that was spent on various items for their education. But we have absolutely no record of the day pupils who attended throughout the same period. So the boarding school and the day school were set up at the same time, similarly large numbers, in both schools. But according to the archive record, only the boarding school is represented. And this is because the records of those boarders are created for very practical purposes. Each child has an entry that records things like money spent on books, combs, medicine, music lessons, excursions, for the simple reason that these costs needed to be recovered from that girl's parents at the end of each term or at the end of the school year. So similar records were simply not needed for the day pupils. These were normally girls who lived within walking distance of the convent, and they paid no fees and were sometimes even educated separately. So the ones that have survived have had that very practical creation and use, which means that the history of the convent, as told by the archive, is not necessarily the whole history of the convent, which is an important element that needs to be reflected by archivists and researchers who use the collection and work with it. So I think one thing in particular that sets religious archive Am I back? Am I unmuted? Yeah. So one thing in particular that sets religious archives apart from their secular counterparts is the opportunity for direct engagement with the current generation of sisters of that order, a truly living heritage. So during my time at the Sepulchrines, I particularly experienced the gift of working side by side with the community that I was researching. And it really enriched my understanding of the historical material. It added a lot of value to what I was working on, and also had practical benefits in that I was able to get a lot more out of the material and from the community themselves. So this importance of linking the historical community with their current lives and work is something that's continued during my time at the Bar Convent. And it's been a real asset in unpacking the many hidden stories that Sister Francis was alluding to within the collections. It's an amazing resource, and it's one I think that is completely undervalued in terms of what sets religious archives apart. And it's an incredibly valuable part of the story of the history of the community and their work, but one that also requires careful balance between the needs of the archive and the needs of the religious community themselves. So ultimately, these archives that we're talking about in this event belong to the communities who created them. It's their story and their heritage. And the privilege of working so closely with both communities has really opened my eyes to this, and to the potential that this offers as well for making the most of the riches of a collection. And one of the most important elements for my job, from my own perspective, is that the community understand and appreciate the value of their own heritage and their own collection, and the necessarily multifaceted nature of that. I work closely with Sister Patricia Harris at the convent, and there are some further examples of how this has been facilitated here. So you can see Sister Anne Stafford and I on the top left, up here cleaning the museum objects in between lockdowns. There's a community workshop in the middle here, where I showcased some of the items from within the collections for them to come and look at. And the top right picture, this is Sister Pat Robb, one of the sisters on site at York, and we sorted out her personal papers for transfer to the archives. And that last image of Sister Pat, I think, points towards the positive impact that can be gained from engaging with the current community. It's given the sisters themselves, I think, an appreciation of the wider story, and also the impact that their own work, has had on the history of the community and should have and should continue to have. And it's encouraged them to ensure that their own work is captured within the collections, and to appreciate their own work in a different way. So in terms of the research element of the job, you heard at the start that I did some work on the Sepulchrines cemetery at Newhall. That's led on to further study. So I'm currently in the final stages of a study comparing convent burying rites and practices at the Sepulchrine Convent Cemetery in Liège and at the Bar Convent in York. So the Liège example provides a case study for the English convents in Europe, and the York example provides a case study for the necessary discretion and caution that was vital for Catholics living in post-Reformation England. And neither one of those studies would have been possible without the other. So I wasn't able to fully appreciate the Bar Convent Cemetery without having examined what was going on at Newhall and previously at Liège. Interestingly, the Bar Convent Cemetery, which you can see on the screen there, wasn't established until 1825, so quite a lot later than the Newhall example. And remarkably, prior to that date, sisters who died at the Bar Convent were buried at the nearby Anglican Church of Holy Trinity on Micklegate, by careful arrangement with several successive vicars across a 140-year period. So this research has had a direct impact on, with my archivist hat on how I catalogue things and how I've been able to describe things in terms of the catalogue, and with my researcher's hat on in terms of better understanding how the convent is working with its local community. So it's part of the York City, the city scene, and how it's kind of interacting with neighbours of varying faiths. Another topic I've been working on, so as we heard yesterday, the Sepulchrine Convent was one of the 22 English convents established in Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and 18 of these English convents were forced to abandon their homes on the continent and seek refuge in England between 1794 and 95. So my research at the time with the Sepulchrines noted that they had sought refuge at the Bar Convent on their way to temporary accommodation at Home Hall in the East Riding of Yorkshire in October 1794. So continuing the research after I'd begun my job at the Bar Convent, it became apparent that the Bar Convent itself is playing a crucial role at this period. It offers a place of shelter and welcome to 3 of those English religious communities, including the Sepulchrines. As the only convent in England, it was also able to offer accommodation within a religious institution for the first time since the communities had left their homes on the continent. and it became a focal point for French and English religious seeking refuge in England during this period. Records from the archive reveal that Reverend Mother Catherine Ruby, I don't have a picture of her, but this is her death notice. She used a system of trusted local people to monitor the arrival of travellers into York. So they would bring her word if any of them were foreigners or were groups of male or female religious, or sort of looked like they were groups of male or female religious. And they were brought to the convent, where she could offer shelter and assistance, and then use her connections within the network of English Catholics to help and facilitate them in whatever way possible. So as early as 1792, French emigre priests were sheltered at the convent. Many of them ended up staying on at the convent and becoming chaplains for the local Catholic community. The daughters of several members of the French nobility came to England, ended up joining the convent as novices, and several books and objects and statues were donated to the convent's collection as a result of these arrivals. So again, a huge part of the convent history that I wouldn't have fully appreciated without my work from the Sepulchrine perspective, to kind of tie all those things together. And it's become clear since then that this part of English Catholicism is a much bigger project that needs to be looked at. So I'm currently looking at ways to expand that into a larger research project in conjunction with other academic colleagues who worked on the French Revolution. But this is a brand new perspective on the French Revolution, kind of the aspect of the English Catholics and particularly the Bar Convent in York playing that vital role for the fleeing refugees, and again, which has direct relevance for current lived experiences of religious refugees for various reasons. And I think as well, this example highlights the importance of this dual perspective of academic and archivist. So it's something that's a bit of a juggling act sometimes between my kind of research hat and my archive hat. But I think you need both perspectives sometimes to fully unlock the history of a collection. And I think you particularly see that with these religious archives. So simply put, I think researchers need archives and archives need researchers. But in a professional sense, the two worlds tend to operate sort of in isolation from each other, particularly in the way that an understanding of how catalogues are put together, how the research process works, all these different elements. And I think that's where events like this are so valuable and vital for creating opportunities for dialogue across that spectrum. So I think hopefully that's given you some idea. It's obviously a very brief run through. There's lots more that could be said, but James was very strict with his timings. I had 20 minutes. So I think it's given you some idea of the role and importance of religious archives more generally. And as we've seen, I think a religious archive is never just a religious archive. It's got so many other perspectives and angles and things to contribute to the wider history. And for example, in the case of the Bar Convent archives and the English CJ province, the collections tap into women's history, the history of education, particularly girls' education, and the story of post-Reformation British Catholicism, and of course the history of the church as a whole. So if anybody thinks any of the material would be useful for their research as well, my details are on the screen, so please do get in touch. If there's anything else, if you want to come and use the collections, we'd be delighted to have you. Yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Hannah, for that. And a lesson for all of us to always be nice to archivists, I think, was what was coming there as well with that. So just to remind you, of course, that you can put questions into the chat function if you send them to me directly. And then I'll ask a few to Hannah, but just to say a few words whilst you're putting your questions in there of how Hannah linked into a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about there already. And particularly the idea now, we've been talking about slotting religious orders full stop into the religious orders full stop into the wider story. But here as well, we're looking at the idea of the archives being slotted in. So we don't want to make the mistake that the archives have everything, but of course you're going to find traces of religious orders in all sorts of archives, including state ones or local ones, but similarly, they're going to complement each other. So to get a full rounded picture. So again, that idea of slotting in always that goes with it and past the story. Also, the notion that other orders do appear in each other's own archives and congregations and communities. So again, they complement each other, work together. And particularly of note, there is the idea that male ones appear and female ones appear in male collections, male and female as well. We want to get away, as Professor Kathleen Spiers-Cummings was saying yesterday, the idea of looking at things in separately all the time, when actually they can complement each other quite a lot. And then just another thought on it as well, just touching on what Hannah said, and she was picking up on something that both Sister Moira and Sister Francis were very clear on. That was the idea of recovering the story and a way of telling that story and thinking in terms of legacy and how you understand it, both for the community, but for the wider world. So a lot of big themes that we have there. So moving on to the questions, we've got just, there's a comment from Caroline Bowden, just for you, Hannah, to have a think about that. The role of the Hammersmith Convent as a shelter for Benedictine community fleeing the French Revolution. I was wondering how much you picked up on the Hammersmith community, the side of, well, what would have been Mary Ward sisters then. Is there much there with the Bar Convent?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Caroline, for that. I think we do have, what little survives from Hammersmith, we do have in the Bar Convent. So it's the provincial repository as well as the York House repository. Hammersmith is interesting because various changes to the way the Institute was run in the sort of 18th century, Hammersmith became quite isolated from the network of the order, and it had gradually kind of fallen into decline. So by the time that these communities were arriving in the 1790s, there were only, I think, 1 or 2 sisters left within its walls, and it then got offered via the Vicar Apostolic in London. It got offered as a refuge to the Benedictines. But interestingly, the Benedictines, one of the conditions of them having the house was that they would continue to look after the elderly CJ sisters, or now CJ sisters, who were still there, who were too elderly to move. So I think there were 3 of them that remained in Hammersmith with the Benedictines until they'd passed away, and they're buried with the Benedictines at Hammersmith as well. So there's a continuing, even after it became a Benedictine house, there's a continuing relationship there between those 2 houses. So it's something we need to do a little bit more work on, I think, the Hammersmith house. But it's, what little we do have is in York. If anybody would like to come and do work on it, be very welcome to.
So thank you, Hannah. It's worth just picking something up that Hannah alluded to there and we haven't touched on, is the difference between a house or community will have their own collection, but of course there's the provincial one as well. And so obviously Hannah's talking about both in that one, which is also always worth remembering as researchers. Sometimes that's something that religious orders know their way around, but sometimes researchers don't. And so it's always worth very much dealing with a friendly archivist like Hannah to ask them, about what it is and where it will be located, the material. Yeah,
and I think that's partly what I was alluding to with the that relationship between the researchers and the archivists, so for each understanding how the other one works. The kind of, especially with this sort of the structure of religious orders is a vital element as a researcher to get your head around.
Yeah. So then, touching on what we were just talking about, Hannah, and looking at other collections, I have a message from Mary McHugh, who's asking, have you had a chance yet to look at any archives within York which might contain information about the Bar Convents and its position within York, so how it's slotted in with wider ones?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So at the moment, I'm just about to start a research project with the University of York, which should have happened last term, but couldn't because of the coronavirus restrictions. So one of the things I've discovered since starting at the convent is about 200 property deeds, which are completely uncatalogued. They were in various boxes and things around the convent. So what we need to do is work out who those deeds relate to, and then work out how they fit in with York stories. So I've had a quick look through them, and there are lots of York, names and addresses and things on there, and that hopefully will then lead to a better understanding of how the Bar Convent fits in more widely with the York story. We've got I've found some records. So we have an interesting incident involving the Minster, York Minster, where there's a prebender who's there who kind of takes it upon himself to get rid of this Catholic threat that's lurking in his city. Jacques Stern, Jacques Stern, his name is. He's the uncle of Lawrence Stern. And he comes back and forth, he writes lots of letters back and forth to the community and tells them that they need to pack up and they need to leave, and they're breaking the law in all sorts of ways. They need to kind of get out now. And he ends up coming to the convent and being treated very nicely by the sisters, being made a lovely cup of tea, and he turns into one of their biggest supporters, and ends up sort of fighting their corner against anybody who will who will look sideways at them. So there's some stuff in the Minster archives that I know is there, but I haven't yet had a chance to go and have a look at. So I'm hoping that these projects with the University of York, this is the third joint project that we've done. I'm hoping they will really start to add more detail to that story of how the convent is fitting in with York as a whole.
Thank you. So the next question is coming 2 questions, and one of them will give you a chance just to plug yourself, Hannah, which is always a nice thing to do. From Pat has the question as well. So what have you learned about the need, scope for religious communities now from your work? And also the question of where is your work recorded? Is there a book, Hannah? So you can mention that again.
There is. I wrote a book about the cemetery, the Newhall Cemetery, which you're very welcome to purchase. It's called The Secret Cemetery. It also has the Bar Convent Cemetery in it, bizarrely. I think I was always being called to the Bar Convent in one way or another. I didn't catch some of the words you said for the first question, James. I heard scope, but you kind of cut out a bit.
Okay, so it was to you got too excited, I think, about the chance to mention your book again, Hannah.
Yeah.
The question was, during your work, what have you learned about the need or scope for religious communities now?
In terms, I suppose in terms of archives, I think one of the things that's particularly grown through the time I've been there is engaging the sisters with their own heritage. And I think in some ways, we were talking yesterday about communities who are kind of looking at the end of the community. They're sort of in the latter stages of the community. And I think the preservation of archives and their heritage is a way to continue their legacy and their heritage beyond the kind of the physical lives of the community. So I think in terms of the scope of their heritage is a key part in that, I think, regardless of sort of what stage the community is at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So then we have a question from Isabel Keating, who thanks you for an absolutely fascinating talk. And she's wondering, relating to the objects, because you mentioned the objects, we haven't talked too much about them yet. Mm-hmm. Do you have physical records on them, or do the sisters have handed down information relating to objects by word of mouth? And so she's found both cases within the Society of the Holy Child Jesus.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I would say both for us as well. So one of the things I managed to do over lockdown, I was digitizing the various physical records that we have about the objects. So they were catalogued in the 1980s on a dot matrix printer file. So there's a big stack of paper records, and there are occasional references to them previously. And what I wanted to create was a database that does exactly what Isabel mentioned there, was a place where we could put all that information and also add to it the stories that we've got about the objects and the sort of the oral tradition that we've got. So some of them, we've got a very strong oral tradition around them, but we haven't got any kind of paperwork to support that, or paperwork that adds any information to that. And that kind of feeds into what I was saying about making sure the community understand what I'm doing. Because it means that they're very willing to then share the story of, Sister so-and-so told me that painting came from this place at that time. And those are vital records that would just otherwise be completely lost. So I think both is the answer, but trying to pull them together into an accessible digital format at the moment.
Yes, I think you're dead right there, Hannah, because we both come across places where there's been an oral tradition, but it's got lost quite quickly, because there's always the assumption, there'll always be someone who knows, because we'll just pass it on. But when nobody notes it down and then nobody passes it on, we have a great problem there. And also what I'm really happy with there that we're talking about, because we've talked a lot about archives, we've talked about libraries, but now we're talking about objects. And it's worth always saying this idea of complete collections, like you're talking about how they complement each other. And on that, I was just going to ask you, actually, leading on from what Isabel was asking there, if you could just talk particularly about the relic collections and about their sensitivities, because of course at the Bar Convent you famously have the relic of Margaret Clifforo's hand, which is quite a big one rather than just a small one to look after. And if you have any thoughts or comments just on that and their importance and how they play a role within the collection.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty big question, I think, because the relics, that's another thing that you get in religious archives or religious collections that you don't find in the secular world. And I think with my kind of archivist hat on, the physical care of relics is quite difficult, because they're often made of mixed materials, and they might have organic nature, they might have gold, sort of precious metals around them. So they have to be very carefully managed in a sort of practical sense. And I think one of the things that the Bar Convent does particularly well that we're keen to keep doing is we've got, obviously it's a religious place, it's a working convent, it's also a sort of tourist destination, for want of a better phrase, for lots of religious groups. So as a result of, Margaret Clitheroe's relic, for example, is particularly is something that a lot of people come to see and to come and visit in the chapel. It's it's in a very special location in the chapel, and it's making sure that that's kind of reflected, because I think it can be too easy to focus on the academic research for things sometimes and the what people then were doing. But a lot of these things in religious archives have direct relevance for for people who are in the church or who have particular beliefs and things who want to come and see them now. So I think it's important to make sure that those both aspects of relics and the other collections are fully represented.
Thank you. And then leading on from that, there's two parts to this question. I'm going to do the one that leads on first, from Marie Giraud, who is a doctoral student at Queen Mary University of London. And she asked, do you look after print and visual culture as well as the letters, text, and what we've mentioned?
Yes, as much as it's been preserved. So one of the a project I've been working on recently is with our kind of current management team to make sure that various kind of modern print things are being preserved. So things like posters from events, that kind of thing. So making sure that things that people who kind of manage our events don't necessarily see as historically significant, but making sure that they're part of it. We've also had some additional textiles added to the collection. So some vestments that we had commissioned for the opening of the chapel in the 18th century, which have gone out to one of the churches in York, which had been lent to them decades ago, I think, and it had kind of just got a bit forgotten that they'd gone there. So just kind of reconnecting with those and getting them back into the collections. They've been very well looked after in the church, I will hasten to add, but they'd kind of become separate from their proper context as part of the Bar Convent history. So yeah, the collection involves all sorts of media, any media that you can think of. We've got VHS tapes, which I'm still trying to find something to play them on. We've got cassettes, we've got USB sticks, we've got everything, as well as the manuscripts and the documents and the letters, and the account books, the kind of traditional material as well. It's a huge range.
Excellent. And then just to follow up, Marie, the other part of Marie's question was to ask, do the archives contain material relating to English Catholics living in Paris before the French Revolution? So, and particularly interested in the first half of the 18th century. I suppose, Hannah, perhaps the way to think about that as well that we could do, and you could talk about, is where some of the Institute's documents have ended up, because obviously there was the Paris house. So not what's just in the Bar Convent, but how you relate to those other collections that are around Europe, basically. Yeah, so the Institute's main archive now is in Germany. The various houses in Germany have got, so they've got, for example, Mary Ward's original letters, Mary Ward's objects, and the painted life. So things that are houses that have no longer exist. So, for example, the Paris house have ended up in those German archives. We've got copies of things in York, but generally, Germany was the kind of centre of the order for quite a long time, and is still quite significant. We had a link with, so one of the reasons we ended up in Paris in the first place was an English Catholic called Edward Somerset, who was in Paris after the English Civil War, so a bit earlier than you're talking about there, Marie. But he gave the community some money to be able to leave England and establish houses in Paris, and then kind of build themselves up again, and then re-establish contact with England, which led to York and Hammersmith. So we've got
documents related to him and to that time in Paris. I don't know off the top of my head about the later English Catholic communities in Paris, but I will certainly have a look, see what we've got.
Thank you. And Hannah, we're going to leave you off with questions there. You worked very hard, because there are a couple more comments that I want to actually save over slightly. And that's that they're going to relate actually as well to some other ones and tie in with yours and link to others.
Okay.
So just to give you an idea where they are, and so we know what's coming, that Dr. William Griffiths has asked about those Benedictine sisters who are at Hammersmith, and where are they now and who were they? Now, all I can say is we've got Scholastica talking later, who's working exactly on that material, which is why I'm not going to ask Hannah about that one. And then, Hannah, you might want to have some just concluding thoughts as well, but I think it'll be one that plays out that Malachi McCarthy has said that the more he deals with religious collections as an archivist and a historian, the role of understanding charism is critical. And it's that element that determines how the community evolves. And he's saying he's interested in what people think. And I just say, from my point of view, I'd see it as critical, and certainly within the Centre for Catholic Studies we're going to have Dr. Liam Temple talking after we've had a break, who's he's only just started, so his interview will be fresh in his mind, and one of the questions being, what is the charism of the Capuchins? And without giving it away, afterwards the Capuchins laughed and said, good, because we don't really know what it is either exactly, to put it really succinctly. So it's testing that, but recognizing the centrality of that charism is a key moment. I just wonder, Hannah, do you have any final thoughts just on that?
Yeah, I think you can see that particularly with the CJ material, as I said earlier, that kind of deeply Ignatian, which I always think of as a sort of practical spirituality, I think is the best way to describe it. So the kind of being free to just do what needs to be done. And I think that certainly has if you understand that, you can understand why the collections take the shape that they do. And I think that charism kind of underpins everything from, the type of women that are being attracted to the order, and the work that they're doing within the order, the type of material that's generated by that work, and the way that they look after the material. I think that understanding of that charism is absolutely central. And I think I found something similar when I worked with the Sepulchrines, because even though they're Augustinian in foundation, their proximity to the English Jesuit house in Liège has an impact on their charism. So as their charism kind of evolves, there's a deeply kind of Ignatian charism again that kind of starts to be seen similarly in that sort of practical, flexible appreciation of their spirituality. So I think absolutely the charism, and I think probably charism as a word to people perhaps outside of the religious world is something that needs to be kind of unpacked as a term, because I think it can sound a bit strange, and it doesn't really have an obvious meaning if you're not within a religious world. So I think it's something we perhaps need to be aware of in terms of breaking down these barriers that we've been talking about. It's a question of language and making sure that the general kind of population understand what we mean by these things and how important they are.
That's great. Thank you, Hannah. So what we're going to have now is 2 quick sessions. Good, he's there now. We're going to have 2 quick sessions, and they're quicker because of the nature of them. So I'll talk firstly to introduce you to Dr. Liam Temple, who is the Capuchin Fellow at the Centre for Catholic Studies. And his book, Mysticism in Early Modern England, was published in 2019. Now, the reason that Liam has this shorter segment is because he's the baby of the Centre for Catholic Studies at the moment. But he only appointed in January, so it's only just started, obviously with lockdown. So what he's going to give us is some of his initial ideas of looking at the material and working on it, and he's working on the Capuchins. So as I said, we had to be gentle with Brian, be even gentler with Liam, because he is very new, okay, and we don't want to scare him off at this point. So Liam, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'll just share my screen with everyone. There we go. And the urge to not put my own book in the chat is overwhelming, so I'll try to avoid that. Can everyone see that okay? Is that working or? Yep. So today I want to talk a little bit about the project, and like James has just said, lockdown has prevented me from looking at a lot of this material or accessing a substantial amount of the material. So what I'm going to focus on today is the theme of potential with what I'm looking at. So I'm going to give a very quick potted history of the Capuchins themselves. I'm going to talk about a little bit about my project in the ways that I'm going to place some archival work I've done already digitally, and then the rest of the archival work into much broader contexts. And then I'm also going to finish up by giving a little bit of a reflection on the importance of preserving and researching material kept by religious congregations in general. And that will feed on quite nicely from what Hannah's already said, and stole a little bit of my thunder, but it's okay. So who are the Capuchins then? A little bit of a potted history. So the Capuchins have their origins in the 1520s as reformers within the observant Franciscans, who sought to adhere to an even stricter observance of evangelical poverty than that order already adhered to. These reformers would eventually come to be known as the Capuchins, getting their name from the one-piece habit they wore with the large hood known as a cappuccio or a capuche. And the Capuchin reform movement had a rocky start, which I realise to many people is a massive understatement, but for this paper I'm going to glaze over that. But they did grow rapidly after that. As you can see there, by 1580, they numbered 6,000 friars in 20 Italian provinces. And when they could spread beyond Italy in 1574, they spread to France, Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, and modern-day Germany. And they were particularly strong in France, where by around 1650, they were divided into 10 provinces, in which there were 287 friaries and 5,363 friars. And to put that in perspective, that's about a quarter of the entire strength of the congregation at the time. So a real focus on France and Paris especially was a big source for what I'm going to talk about with English Catholicism. So in the early modern period as well, they would establish missions across the globe, spreading to America, Canada, Brazil, India, and parts of Africa, among others. So when we've had this discussion about transnational movements and the nature of these orders, the Capuchins are a real great example of the transnational nature of some of these movements. So while there were several attempts to instigate a mission into Britain in the early modern period and into Ireland, this was done largely due to the efforts of an Irish Capuchin called Francis Nugent, who gained permission for a mission finally in 1608 after lots of shuffling around and politics on the continent trying to get the mission going. And we know that before 1800, there were around 75 Capuchins active in Britain, although I'm hoping that number will slowly go up the more research I do. Some were English, Scottish, and Irish, and we know there's at least one Welshman, while others were French and Italian, with most of the French coming from Paris and serving in the chapel of Henrietta Maria at Somerset House. And the modern province was established after the restoration of the hierarchy in 1850, slowly spreading across the southeast of England and Wales. And at the moment, the British province has friaries in Erith, Oxford, Chester, and Pantassath in northeast Wales. And then more widely, there are around 10,500 friars present in around 100 countries across the globe at the minute, so still very much an international movement. And that's a picture there of one of their founders, Matteo de Basio, who was an incredibly important figure. But actually, if I talk a little about those controversies, left, I think within 10 days of founding the order, he'd left and he'd returned to the observant Franciscans. So I want to give a little highlight of some of the things that I've been looking at so far, and a little discussion about that potential that I'm looking at. So I believe that the lives, experiences, and the writings of British Capuchins can bring us important new perspectives on the history of Catholicism, both early modern and modern, as my project spans both of those, as well as wider categories and historical fields. So one of the earliest examples that I've looked at is an English Capuchin called Benedict of Canfield in the late 16th century, whose popularity as a preacher and spiritual guide in France actually meant that he spent little time in his homeland of England. In Paris, he became a spiritual collaborator with, among others, Pierre de Bérulle, who had himself found an entire mystical way of French Catholic spirituality, which would inspire figures like Francis de Sales as well. And Canfield wasn't just a spiritual advisor, he also had a part-time career in politics, which resulted in his arrest over what he believed was the overextension of political powers into the affairs of the church over the legitimacy of exorcism cases at the end of the 15th century. So here we have a Capuchin from Essex playing a major role in France in terms of spiritual revival, politics, the legitimacy of exorcism, the struggle between church and state, and also the promotion of cosmopolitan lay spirituality. So studying Canfield can therefore tell us much more about spirituality, a lot about politics, and a lot about religious change in France, and bring new perspective to those issues as well. And that's Canfield there, pictured just on the left-hand side there. So the Scottish Capuchin Epihynius Lindsay is another example, whose letters are preserved in the propaganda archives in Rome. And he can shed new light on the state of Catholicism in Scotland in the early modern period. And Lindsay makes an incredible statement in one of his letters that, to his knowledge, there was only 3 priests in the whole of Scotland when he arrived in 1620. And a letter sent to propaganda in 1623 by 2 minim priests explains that there are actually no secular priests in Scotland at all, and only 15 members of the religious orders. And those were 4 minims, 4 Jesuits, 3 Scottish and 1 Irish Franciscan, 2 Capuchins, and a lonely Benedictine. And Lindsay, who spent his life travelling Scotland disguised as a shepherd, carrying bagpipes, which he played at fairs and other gatherings as a cover to meet with Catholics, is not only a really fascinating and I think understudied figure, but he also has much to tell us about things like the existence of and the thrivingness of Scottish Catholicism in the period, the coexistence of religious orders working together to try to sustain a Catholic community, persecution, violence, anti-Catholicism, and how Roman propaganda viewed and responded to the needs of Catholics in Britain. There's this constant lobbying to send more missionaries into Scotland, and it's really interesting to look at how that response was framed. Sadly, I don't have a picture of the bagpipe wielding shepherd disguising Capuchin. If I did, he would definitely be up there, but sadly I haven't found one yet, but it's one of my life's goals now to find that picture. So if we move forward a little bit to the Capuchins returning to England post-emancipation, we have some really great examples to draw on as well in terms of much wider contexts. So until 1963, the Capuchins travelled yearly to the hop fields of Kent to support impoverished Catholic families who came from London to work the fields every autumn and earn more money in what were dire living and working conditions. Knowing that they had little to connect them to the Catholic faith during those months, so these are strangers to the area with no real connections, the friars would say Mass in the open air or under a tent to these communities of working class Catholics, even while others played football and cooked breakfast around them. So it must have been this bizarre scene that you have this group of Catholics gathering for Mass and everyone else is just ignoring that this is going on around them. And you can see I've put 2 pictures there of Capuchins in the hop fields, and then the poster reads, Catholic hop pickers, Sunday next, Holy Mass. So that's what it says on the tin really there. So what I think about examples like this and what I'm planning to use examples like this to look at is to feed into wider discussions about poverty, charity, immigration, economic migration, working conditions, and indeed working class history in this period. And I think that this gives a good window, a new window and a new perspective on some of these issues that we can really use the Capuchins as a focus for. And then there's also the really brilliant example of the motor missions, which were established in the mid-20th century. And these were from Pantasif under the community with Father Aloysius, in the mid-20th century, in which Capuchins would travel long distances in vans, often with the help of local nuns, to isolated local communities, not only to provide Mass and the sacraments, but also to provide a Catholic education for the local children who didn't have opportunities for learning in these quite isolated areas. We can see there on the left-hand side, Father Cuthbert at a house Mass, and Father Aloysius Ward on the right-hand side of that right picture there on the motor mission with his beautiful board of information behind him as well. So what I'm really interested in looking at in examples like this is again about looking at wider ideas about the provision of education in the period, the cooperation again of religious orders to meet the demands of Catholics, and also the role that religious congregations played in the revival of the Catholic faith across Britain in the post-emancipation period. The Capuchins were quite central to those early days post-emancipation. I also think it can bring new insight into the conditions in Britain away from urban centres. So in terms of things like infrastructure, education, living conditions, and networks of communication as well. So there's lots of different fields that I think this research can contribute to, and I'm aiming to do that as well. So really, I think to do a bit of a conclusion, I want to re-stress the point that I think so many other scholars have made at this event, and that's that these collections are unbelievably important to our understanding of much wider themes, processes, and movements in history. I know from what work I've done with the Capuchin material so far already, that it has the potential to contribute to our knowledge not just of Catholicism, but also of social, cultural, political, intellectual, and obviously religious history more generally. So there's much wider fields that this research can contribute to. And one thing I think is really important is that this sort of project can lead to renewed attention on other collections as well. And that brings important new insights to them. So my work on the Capuchins, for example, is pointing me towards investigating other collections of material which are held at Palace Green Library in Durham. And this includes material from the Poor Clares of Woodchester, as well as material from the missionary Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate Conception, both of which contain material by Capuchins and will undoubtedly be of interest to the project. So again, like what Hannah was saying, these collections and this material starts to link up. And I've also looked at letters at Ushaw College in Durham, just local to us here as well. So that's bringing in another element that I'm interested to link up. So that theme of potential, I think, is really important and gives us a sense that these collections can slowly become really interconnected in productive, interesting, and important ways to produce much wider narratives than otherwise would have been possible. So part of the conversation that we've been having is about just the survival of these collections on a very basic level, but it's also knowing that the contents can help us make much wider pictures that emerge as a result of connecting these collections together. So there's new dimensions that can emerge from the interconnected nature of these different collections. And I also think, and I would echo what everyone else has said about that working on these sorts of collections is an incredibly rewarding experience for scholars. And part of that is because you are working with the congregations that are the living and present embodiment of the history that you are studying. So we're the first to say that our research, I think, is only possible because of the generosity and the knowledge of the religious themselves that are helping us. And certainly I've benefited from that already with the Capuchins and the discussions that I've been having with the friars. So to be able to discuss your work, to get opinions and advice and work closely in partnership is certainly something that many scholars, I think, never experience. I can remember before working on the Capuchins, I did some work on Benedictine material and also on material from the Poor Clares of Darlington, which is my hometown. So they've got a very, very special connection for me. But I can remember still getting letters from the archivists of the Poor Clares and just opening these letters and having these nuggets of information that I would never have found out any other way, and just being really excited about what that will do for my research and having that connection. So I'm certainly very keen for my project to be seen as a partnership with the Capuchins, working together on resources and including them in the research as it develops. So it isn't simply about academics working on collections detached from the involvement of the orders themselves. It's partnership and collaboration. And I think that's a genuine strength of the field that we work in and the work that we all do. And then to conclude, because I'm nothing if not cheeky, I've put my email address up there for anyone who would like to discuss the project more, because I know my time is quite short here. But also if anyone, because there's lots of archivists in the audience, have any pointers to make about Capuchin material, I'd be really interested in linking up lots of different archives in the way I've started to hint about there. So that's my 10 minutes done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. That was great. And touching on a number of the things like you acknowledged that we've been talking about, and I particularly just flagged that you were really clear there with the idea of fitting into that wider context and different social movements and patterns. It'd be worth just saying that that Liam's role within this is he's going to write a book that will be a more popular one that will be about the history of the relationship between the Capuchins and Britain. So like he said, not just the Capuchins in Britain, but also British Capuchins around the world when they went. And as part of that, he will be looking at the main archive that's in Erith, the main Capuchin archive, but he's also going to be going, as we've already mentioned, Vatican, Rome, but he's also going to be going to India, which is where there was some missionary activity by the British Capuchin province. So we're going to move on now, and thank Liam once again for that, to Scholastica Jacob, who's currently a PhD student with the Centre for Catholic Studies. And we're keen to encourage doctoral research into this area as well. We've talked a lot at the moment, a lot of people who are postdocs who are further in their careers, but with PhD students as well. And we currently have several working in the field, but Scholastica is in her final year researching Benedictine nuns in the early 19th century, but I'm going to let her describe in much more detail what she is studying. So thank you, Scholastica.
Hi, thanks, James. I'm just going to try and, I'll try and share the screen in a moment, actually. I'm going to start off in the 10-minute slot I've got, just to give you a very brief survey of the archives that I'm actually working on and tell you a little bit about what I've found there. And then I'd like to actually, probably picking up on what a lot of people have already said, to share some of the opportunities and challenges which I've encountered during my research in them. So as James said, I'm in the final year of my doctorate here at the CCS. And since September 2019, I've been working on the 19th century history of 5 English Benedictine communities of nuns. But in fact, my immersion in their archives goes back much further. In a previous life, as a member of Stanbrook Abbey, I had the privilege of being the community archivist for 10 years. So I've actually got a huge advantage of approaching religious archives, both as an insider and now as an outside researcher as well. So I feel very fortunate in having that. So just to try and, okay, yeah. Right, I hope everyone can see that. I thought it would be helpful just to put up a guide to the communities that are in my study and their whereabouts now, because actually it's quite a complicated area. 6 English Benedictine convents were founded in France and the Low Countries in exile in the 17th century. My research is actually looking at 5 of these, all of which sought refuge in England, back in England, after the French Revolution. So you can see here, the first one was founded in Brussels in 1598, and after various moves in England, finally closed in 1979. A foundation from Brussels, or it was actually the result of a split within the Brussels community, was formed in Ghent in 1624. Again, they returned to England as refugees in 1795. And after various moves, they closed a couple of years ago. The third community, which was founded from Ghent, so continuing down this line, is the one that was mentioned earlier by Hannah, which came to England and sought refuge in the ex-Mary Ward convent in Hammersmith. And they subsequently moved to Teignmouth and then closed in 1987. The community, which is now Stanbrook Abbey, was founded in Cambrai in 1623, came back to England in 1795, and after several moves are now still alive and well in Stanbrook Abbey, Was, North Yorkshire, where they moved in 2009. They made a foundation in 1651 at Paris, and the community from Paris also came back and had a bit of a travel around England before settling in Colwich in Staffordshire, and they actually closed down earlier this year, with some of the remaining nuns coming to Stanbrook. So in addition to these, actually, there were 2 other foundations made on the continent of English Benedictine nuns, but one subsequently came under Irish jurisdiction, and the second closed in 1786. So for obvious reasons, neither of them is included in my study of 19th century English Benedictines. A lot of work, as a lot of you know, has been done on the convents in the continental period up to around 1800. And the Who Were the Nuns website is a hugely valuable resource for this. For researchers of the nuns in the early modern period, much of the historic material which has survived is now available at regional and national archives in France, and therefore is fairly readily accessible to researchers. At least it was for those that could travel to France. My thesis takes up the story of the nuns' experience in what I argue is their new exile. So after their migration to England from 1794, 1795, up until getting on towards the middle of the 19th century, there is a void in the historiography of religious women's history for this period, not least, I think, because of what has been perceived as being the scarcity of original source material. This, in large, is because all the English communities in exile suffered loss of property during and after the French Revolution. And most of the Benedictines who arrived back in England had come back with barely all they could carry, and that was it. We heard from Sister Moira yesterday that some communities were more fortunate. So the Canonesses, for example, were actually able to be quite organized and pack and bring up many belongings. The Benedictine convents all had a rather different history, and several of them suffered imprisonment and expulsion from their communities. So they weren't able to bring any property at all. And thus there is a huge gap in their archival material, which is in existence now, most of which dates only from 1794, 1795. Benedictines, however, are chroniclers and annalists. And from the moment of arrival in England, all the nuns began to document their new life. They assiduously collected material, correspondence, annals, journals, and spiritual writings. As also been touched on before, they collected a lot of objects, and we have cups, we have clothes, we have all kinds of sort of objets which were kept and venerated because of the particular stories they were associated with, and especially around their survival and their exile. So in 200 years in England, from arrival in 1795, all the communities that I'm looking at had actually built up a very rich treasury of material and artifacts. And incidentally here, I would just like to challenge some of the ideas that were being talked about yesterday, that archivists don't encourage hoarding. Monastic archivists, I would say from personal experience, most certainly do. And part of the challenge in working with monastic archives is sifting the gold from the grit. And then actually, when one has done that, discovering that even the grit tells us a lot about the community who preserved it. As you will have appreciated, only one of the communities is really still in existence today. And that therefore has created a bit of a challenge with their archives. Luckily, they all have extensive archive collections, and they have all been preserved and are rescued. The community from Brussels, lastly at Hazelmere, is now mostly at Dowie Abbey Archives, although there is some at it's mostly at Downside Abbey, but there is also some at Dowie Abbey. The Ghent, latterly Alton, and the Dunkirk, finally Teignmouth collections are also both at Dowie Abbey Archives. The Combray Stanbrook community have kept their archives with them, and it's a really massive and rich collection. And the Paris collection has now also come to join the remaining nuns at Stanbrook Abbey. So I've been lucky enough to visit both Downside and Dowie, and to work on several occasions and to work on the collections there. They haven't been curated really, apart from the way they were by the nuns. They're mostly still stored in the boxes, just as they were filled by the nuns. And the only way to approach them is to pile into the box and wade through an often very random and miscellaneous selection of items. There's still a huge amount that remains to be analysed at both those collections. Being given permission to take digital images has been a great benefit, but it can never capture and never replace the actual tangible engagement with the material itself. And of course, there's the danger of missing really vital details by just looking at digital images. The community from Paris, which is now at Stanbrook, were able to bring back probably more material than the other communities. And they have a particularly fine collection of manuscripts and rare books, some of which have already been worked on, but there's an awful lot more to do. Access to the Colwich and the Stanbrook collections are a bit more difficult because they're both kept within the monastic enclosure. And the community, understandably, has neither the time and has very limited resources to deal with inquiries. But both collections do hold a very rich store, which is going to repay investigation in the future. I don't have very much time to talk about the findings that I've come across in the archives, but I'd just like to mention a couple of areas of interest. The archives have largely confirmed my thesis that the early 19th century was perceived by the nuns as a new exile. It wasn't a glorious homecoming back to their native land, but it was a further exile. And this is particularly apparent from the study of letters and personal meditations by the nuns, as well as petitions and more official communications, which have been preserved and which reveal extensive efforts to return to the continent until as late as the 1820s. Benedictines are fundamentally textual communities, and the archives have revealed a goldmine of manuscripts and old books. As well as actual surviving volumes, I've been able to examine book lists and library catalogues, and these have revealed a lot about the spiritual and cultural position of the communities at the time. They've also revealed the changing nature of devotional practice in the post-revolutionary period. Perhaps most significant in the exile evidence is the migration narratives they recorded. And this was also mentioned yesterday by Sister Moira in connection with the Canonesses. These contemporary accounts by survivors reveal the depth of alienation the nuns experienced in England. And they are also, of course, of huge value, not just to religious historians, but to studies of refugees, and particularly contemporary refugee situation, historians of the book, and women's writing and literature. Another important discovery has been the changing nature of family networks and interconnections within and between the communities. Working on all 5 collections has revealed that while there was little cooperation and sharing between the houses at the time, there was a significant amount of interconnectedness in terms of family dynasties. School and entrance records reveal fascinating lines of connection. And again, there is evidence of global connections, which I'm just starting to tap into a bit more. I'm also finding a growth in transfers between communities and a sort of practice of what I call community surfing between houses. And also, interestingly, to pick up on what Hannah was talking about a bit earlier, there was quite a lot of intercommunication between several of the Benedictine communities and the Bar Convent. The collections have also revealed the level of empowerment and autonomy that the nuns practiced, albeit rather below the radar. They worked within the structure of a male ecclesial authority. And actually, from the archives, we can see that they retained a considerable agency in actual reality. Again, the archives tell us much more than the official records. The annals, for example, of the English Benedictine congregation really just suggest that the nuns are often little more than a footnote. So I think there's a lot of material here for historians of women and gender studies, as well as religious historians. Just to conclude, I'd like to make a few observations from my own experience with the archives. It's been mentioned already that nun archivists in the past have been very protective of their collections. And I think this is partly because, or largely because, as already been suggested, nuns' archives are private family collections. They were never kept as a public record. And it's therefore only too reasonable that some communities may be apprehensive about opening them up to a wider audience. There's also the difficulty that a lot of the archive collections have largely, although they're physically there in boxes and cupboards, they've never been catalogued or preserved in a way that could be shared. The memory is in the head of the archivist and it's passed on to subsequent archivists. And I think of an example of a wonderful old mug in one of the boxes at Stanbrook Abbey Archives, which just says just has a little sort of caption on it saying the mug that Dame Agnes took her last drink from. Now, to any sort of outside researcher coming in and looking at that, it's not going to mean anything at all. To everybody in the community, it is the mug of Dame Agnes Robinson, who was one of the last survivors from the Compiègne prison, and was sort of one of the great heroines of the community. So there is a need for community archivists to be encouraged and supported in kind of making their collections available and shared, perhaps with a wider audience. The challenge, I think, for lay researchers and historians is to find ways of sharing with the communities the fruit of their own subject, and to bring it to the attention of the communities first, and also to share with the community their findings, but also to listen to the community. I think it's vitally important for researchers coming in to try and involve themselves as much as possible in the activities of the community. So maybe going to attend the Divine Office, for example, or trying to meet some of the sisters to talk about their lives. Of course, one of the real dangers is that there's a rich store of religious history, not only in the material collections of the archives, but also in the heads of the members of the community. And this is a kind of tradition that's passed on. It's very much an oral tradition, which is passed on from community member to community member by the generations. And as these members are dying off, so there is a real danger that the chain of lived communication will die. And there's been quite a lot of conversation recently about ways of encouraging the collection of oral memories from older members of communities before it's too late. I think this is a really important aspect when we come to consider religious archives, that the archives aren't just the material, they're also the people, to try and collect their memories. So just very, very quickly in conclusion, I'd like to say that I'm really excited by the richness of the material that I've found in the Benedictine communities and the opportunities that it offers, not only for historians of women religious, but for much wider interdisciplinary work, which I've tried to touch on. I'm also excited by the corresponding research that is being done in other religious archives, which we've already heard about over the last 2 days. I see much potential for future sharing and joined up exploration on religious archives in the years ahead. And I hope that when lockdown finally ends, even though my thesis will also be coming to an end, that I'll be able to continue my research in these very rich and exciting collections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scholastica, there for talking us through what's going to be a really important piece of research, especially because the way that people sort of forget about the presence of those contemplative communities before the active orders arrive, if you like, in the mid-19th century or so. It also, as well, just to say as well, we've mentioned the French Revolution a bit there, but also the idea of moments of rupture and how it works with that. We can see here the movement of collections, or not the movement of collections, depending on what's happening. But thank you very much for that, Scholastica. We're not going to have questions directly to Liam and Scholastica, because I said we're going to leave them a bit easier, because as I said, Liam's only just started and Scholastica as well, helping us here as a PhD student. But what I would say, those of you who have sent questions, I've now forwarded them to both Liam and Scholastica, so they will message you back in the chat function. Just quickly, also in that chat function, Liam has added the emails of all of the speakers for today and yesterday, because I know a few of you have been asking for emails, so you can find them there at the moment. But I'm very conscious that we've just slipped a tiny bit in time, so I want to go to our final speaker, who's going to bring a lot of what we've been talking about together, who is Professor John McCafferty at University College Dublin, who is director of the Mícheál O'Clery Institute there. And within that, he's worked in a unique partnership with the Irish Franciscans, whose transfer of manuscripts and rare books has been one of the most significant donations ever made to an Irish university. And John is also linked to that. He's also the chair of the Irish Manuscripts Commission. So you can see that he wears a lot of hats. And so he's going to bring things together for us now. So John, to you, thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, James. And thanks to everybody who's spoken so far. I found it extremely stimulating and extremely interesting. And I'm going to share my screen with you now, hopefully. Can you see that all right, James? Yeah. Okay. I'm conscious of the fact that today is the Feast of the Annunciation. And there are a lot of depictions of the Annunciation. I'm kind of interested in them because I'm trying to work on that moment in Western art where Mary is depicted reading while she's interrupted by the angel. But this particular image here from the Met Museum in New York is one that really fascinates me, and I think might help us to think around the subject that we're talking about today. Because here's Mary, and the angel has appeared, and the angel has, uniquely, I've never seen this before, a legal contract in its hand. There it is. It's got the seals of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And I like this image, and you can see Mary's reaction there. She's kind of like saying to herself, you know, would I buy a used car from this angel, let alone embark on what I've got to do here? I like this image because I think it says something about the nature of religious archives and the kind of transaction that's involved. Some years ago, when I was involved in the final closure of the Franciscan house in Limerick, we came across an account book with the names of thousands and thousands of people who'd given money during the 19th century for the beautification of the church. And I think that's a useful thing to think about. The existence of what looked to be purely secular records in religious archives. I mean, they're an account book. But of course, an account book with JMJ or IHS or AMDG on the top is not the same as the account book that, say, for instance, my eldest daughter keeps to pay off her student loans. Because one of those account books, like the one we saw in the Limerick Friary, points towards the transcendent, points towards the fact that religious archives are the archives of communities of faith. And I think that's very important in the way in which we look at these archives. And I just want to explore that a little bit in the short time I have here, because what I want to do is kind of flip what we've been talking about and think about what kind of histories and what kind of historians could these archives make. And I suppose the first thing to say is every archive is very, very specific, and Scholastica just referred to that. A monastic archive is very different to, and you can see an example there, of a mendicant or Franciscan archive. Monastic archives traditionally have been indeed about accumulation. Mendicant archives, for instance, have often been about use. And you could replicate that. Dominican archives are different from the archives, say, of the Mercy Sisters. A Redemptorist archive is different from the archive of a convent of Cistercian nuns. But at the end of the day, all these archives have something in common. And it's something that Bonaventure talks about. When Bonaventure talks about the book of nature and the book of creation, he talks about creation being a ladder by which people can return through its contemplation back to God, back to the source of creation itself. Now, very often when we think about religious archives, we think of, especially nowadays, with so many communities coming towards completion or whatever we like to call it, we often think of the historians and the scholars who are lay people or secular people accessing those archives as the active people, and the religious as the passive, as the keepers and so on. But I think one of the good things that's come out of what we've been talking about in today and yesterday is the collaboration and the partnership between those two different communities. So what I want to talk about now very briefly is, what do those archives have to offer secular people? And what assumptions do they challenge in the minds of those in the secular academy? And, you know, there's a scriptural basis for this, of course, when we look at the second letter of Timothy, bring me the books and above all the manuscripts. But of course, here in this letter, what we're talking about is precisely that kind of sharing. And I just want to talk about some of the things that have, for me, struck me over the last few days about the way in which we do history that's challenged by religious archives and that present a big opportunity. I think one thing that's come up repeatedly is that sense of the collapse of time. Historians very often obsessed with periodization and thinking about periodization, and you know, when the Middle Ages end, when does early modernity begin, when do people become modern? Religious archives give us a chance to see human communities through a very, very long period of time and counting time quite differently. Again, in my experience with the Franciscans, I've often been struck by the immediacy with which they talk about people who are dead for 300, 400 years. I had one experience a few years ago with one friar where we found the death mask of Luke Wadding, a very important figure for the Irish Franciscans. And the friar looks at it and he goes, "Ah, Luke, bad-tempered in death, just as he was in life," as if he had known him. Now, this is a very elderly friar, but even he wasn't 400 years old. So I think that sense of the collapse of time is a real challenge to secular historians who are used to thinking often in a teleological or a linear way. I think the other thing that's really important in religious archives, and a big opportunity for historians, is to rethink the whole question of individuality and community. Because this has come up again and again over the last 2 days. You know, the desire of religious communities to be self-effacing, to, as it were, delete or mute the individual, and also the way in which, as we all know, religious life throws up incredibly strong characters. Difficult people, hard to deal with people, people you wonder would they have survived outside the cloister, all of these things. And I think that divide between me and us is something that historians and literary scholars and others can learn a lot from religious archives about, and how to negotiate that. And I think another issue, which is very, very important and emerges from religious archives, is a fundamental and protean issue, and that's the whole issue of gender and sexuality, which people talk about endlessly. I mean, we have a huge public discourse these days about gender and its meaning, and about people transitioning from one gender to another, or are there genders to transition to, and all of these kind of issues. And I think religious archives are very, very interesting, because what they do is they are archives of single-sex communities, but you see consistently, and all of the speakers have alluded to this, the way in which male and female religious work together. And even if their own order doesn't have either a cognate male or female branch, of that charism, there is that collaboration between men and women and a negotiation of those male and female roles. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. Now, I could talk more about these. The other point I'd like to make is a big challenge for historians is the one that's come up from Kathleen's talk at the beginning to Scholastica's at the end, and that's the whole issue of geography. So nuns who are in Ballinasloe are also simultaneously, by connection, by movement, in a leper hospital in sub-Saharan Africa. And that sense of being deeply inside the cloister and also being in a universal place, I think is something very important for historians to think about, because often historians put too much emphasis on national identity, local identity, provincial identity, and fail to realize what religious archives show is the multiple identities that people can have at the same time. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that there's a big opportunity here to make a wide contribution to our understanding of humanity. Because in some ways, religious life looks like something that's lived on the margins. I mean, when you think about it and the world we live in, religious discourse about poverty and the giving up of material objects runs contrary to our dominant consumer and ultimately suicidal culture. Religious discourse about obedience in a society, in Western societies at least, which elevate individuality and individual autonomy to the highest level is a serious challenge and seems to sit at the margin of society. And then religious discourse about chastity and sexuality is, of course, a huge challenge to, again, Western societies, which claim that sexual activity and sexualization are the only way to achieve full humanity. So I think all of these are very, very important, because what religious archives show is something that we constantly don't think about, which is the living in community of people who share a religious ideal is something that is not particular to a particular time or space. It's a human constant. In other words, religious archives are not some outlier on the wider body of human society. Religious archives are actually an example of a form of human community that has existed in pretty much all cultures, all religions, and at all times. So religious archives aren't an add-on to how we do history and how we investigate history. I think religious archives are a form of human organization which is as central to our understanding of human history as, say, studying political parties or armies or monarchs or, take your choice. So religious archives is a serious phenomenon. So just to finish, I just want to outline what I think, for me anyway, has come out of the last few days in terms of the work of the CCS in this sphere and what can be done in terms of the wider discourse. And in some ways, I'm repeating things that are being said. We've all talked about the opportunities that the archives give us, and I think they're very, very important. There's a huge opportunity for people to be trained here. There's a huge opportunity to test the genres in which people do history. So what I'm saying really is that people, shouldn't be going to religious archives to find extra stuff. We should be going to religious archives to think about things differently than the way we did. Religious archives are potentially disruptive of the way the academy does its business. And I think that's a good thing, and it should be embraced because it allows us to test our assumptions. The other thing that I think is, I suppose, then finally, is just to outline some of the challenges. We all know the challenges of the decline in numbers. We all know the challenges in, Scholastica just referred to it. I mean, how is a community to serve as an archive when these archives haven't been constructed in this way, and when they're not like the British Library? They don't have the staffing. They don't have all these things. And I think another thing that we need to be very, very conscious of too is the other challenge, the less tangible challenge, which is the discourses that many historians bring to these archives and the need to mediate them. And I thought of three last night when I was cycling home. Discourses of inquisition. And this is particularly marked in the Irish experience. as if the church existed only for the sole and total purpose of abusing some individuals at some time. So discourses of Inquisition, present-centered discourses, I suppose. Roots of assumption, where people assume the church archives contain various things. And I think one of the more delightful things and brilliant things is, we all know from working on these archives, is the way in which often you can be stunned by the way in which functioning as families, religious congregations don't keep stuff, like all families. Every now and then an abbess comes along and says, clean out all that stuff from the 18th century, we don't need it anymore. I've got some lovely new cassette tapes that I bought. We can have everything on that kind of thing that happens. So an assumption there that there's these hidden records and that the religious are keeping them all, which is incorrect. And then I suppose finally is what I call the root of condescension. The game is over for you guys. We're here to see what bits and pieces we can pick out to fit our existing discourses. And I think that's a very important thing to mediate, to go back to my point that actually what religious archives present is a huge opportunity to rethink the way that we do history. And I suppose what I want to do then, just by way of a final word, is to say something about my own personal understanding that I've come to after 20 years of working in partnership with the Irish Franciscans and dealing with people in the CCS and talking to people and working in various different archives. And it's this, and I would make a t-shirt of this if I could, except I have too many t-shirts. I'm also a vast consumer, so I am what I also condemn. And it's this, is that at the end of the day, and for us to understand religious archives, and for us to bring out what is best in them, and to bring out what is best in them for all of us together, both religious and secular people, is that at the end of the day, religious archives are tangible recordings of intangible callings. And the minute we forget that, the minute we don't write that on the back of our hand and always remind of ourselves of that, then our time in some ways in those said archives, which were constructed for that purpose, to be tangible recordings of intangible callings, then we're wasting our time. But everyone here is not wasting their time. And I want to thank everyone for participating in this, because it's been so insightful and so brilliant and such a testimony to the work that the CCS has been doing in this sphere. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, John. We have got time for a couple of questions. If people want to send them in, we can push through just a little bit through our 7 o'clock barrier, just for a couple of minutes if we want to. What John was saying there, I think, as he said, he's done most of the summing up for me, actually, so I don't really have to do anything, which is even better. And he's really done great with that. And what I would just chime is something that's been mentioned again, and John picked up on it there when we were talking about the idea of charism and religious ideas there, that it's marked how some historians or researchers will not count the religious as part of that, if you see what I mean, as part of the experience within that religious community. And that's a key idea, and one thing that we've seen today, definitely a huge kick against today and yesterday, and as John was saying there, and really just to underline that it can test the assumptions of not just the wider world and the secular world, but also the academic world. I just wondered, John, if you just wanted to say something else as well on multiple identities, because we haven't talked about that too much. We've talked about the local, national, international, but I wondered if you just wanted to say something on that idea.
Yeah, okay, I suppose, okay, well, I'll give an example from working in the Franciscan archives, and I'll be utterly honest here. One of the things that happened when the Franciscan archives came to UCD, to University College Dublin, about 21 years ago now, the university was interested in those archives because they contained a number of very, very iconic manuscripts to do with Irish history in the round. You know, real showpiece manuscripts. What became increasingly clear was that because Irish Franciscans, like their Capuchin brothers, were very, very involved in cultural nationalism and the Irish language movement and all those things, what became very, very clear to us very, very rapidly that was all there. That was all brilliant. But unless you had an understanding of the purpose of history and history writing in the Franciscan tradition, you had no ability to interpret what was going on with those archives and the broader records in which they sat. So, you know, it's the way in which any individual religious and any individual community can be political, can be an economic actor, can have a pastoral role, can have an identity, a national identity, can have all these things, and they're all functioning at the same time together. And as you point out, indeed, in your own book on the English convents, James, this is one of the things I just thought I'd get you a plug in, and an excellent book it is too, is, you know, you can be very, very English sitting in your convent in the Low Countries in the 17th century, and be hankering after cheese and roast beef and the things we know that they hankered after. But you can also develop a reputation, an international reputation. So the English nuns were famous for the strictness of their enclosure. And it made them part of that international thing. And I think the way those two things sat together, there's no way you can separate out their essential Englishness from their obsession with enclosure. Those two identities are working together. One speaks to the universal church, and the other speaks to the communities back in England who were sending their daughters to them. So I suppose that's what I mean there.
Okay, thank you, John. We've just got time for one more quick question. We've got one from Need McGavin here, who asks, in your perspective, what's the best way to write the histories of faith experiences? Should we be thinking about the history of emotions as a helpful framework, or do these not quite fit together in your view? So touching on what you were saying about the different ideas that come into it.
Yeah, yeah, I see. I mean, history of emotions, I think, is a very, very useful way of approaching a lot of faith experiences. I suppose what I would say, and Neve's heard me say this before, but if you go to work in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, you probably will learn enough French to get yourself a cup of coffee and order the manuscripts you want. Unless you're astonishingly arrogant, and I don't recommend trying it in Paris, you won't rock up to the desk and speak in English to the person behind the desk, because it won't end well. And I think when it comes to religious faith, the church has, over 2,000 years, developed specialist languages, specialist vocabulary, and specialist sciences for understanding itself. And I think it behoves historians to learn the languages of the locality in order to understand the religious experience. Even if you have no religious faith yourself, I think you have to. There's an example that people often use, and it drives me crazy. It's this thing, you know, people talk about the church and so on, and then there's this thing, journalists use it a lot, and they say, oh, the bishops are so concerned about the number of angels that can fit in the head of a pin. That is missing the point completely. The number of angels that can fit in the head of a pin is an incredibly important concept, because, as everybody knows, angels take up no space. So by even advocating this as the kind of thing that people in the church are thinking about is a total failure of understanding. So what I think is really, really important is to understand the working languages of the church, because, again, as I say, you wouldn't go on a research trip and you wouldn't go on your holidays without trying to learn at least the local word for beer, wine, and I'd like something to eat, please.
Thank you, John. I think your plea for something to eat perhaps is the sign that it's time for us to begin wrapping up there, a not so subtle hint for it. And so thank you very much, John, for bringing us to a closer. I'm going to hand over in a minute for final thanks from Professor Paul Murray, the director of the Centre for Catholic Studies. But I'd just like to say myself, I do thank everybody for attending, but also to thank our speakers. And just to say one more last thing, which is a sort of plug, and that's to say that actually we will actually be advertising a new post, hopefully within the next week or two, to work with the La Retraite sisters on their early modern history in France and their role within France and what they were doing there. And so I'm going to hand over now, please, to Professor Murray, if he could unmute himself.
Well, goodness me, what a wonderful couple of events this has been, and seamlessly wonderful, but brought to an electric conclusion, though. Well, not conclusion, a launch pad for us, John. Really brilliant, brilliant final session. Thank you so much. I want a few words of thanks. Firstly, to all of you participants for sharing in this event from around the globe. It shows the level of interest. Thank you to the organizing team, led so well by you, James, and with Liam Temple, Brian Casey, Cormac Begaden within the direct Durham team, but in such close and important association with Dr. Hannah Thomas, you, Professor John McCafferty, and Professor Kathleen Spowes-Cummings. Thirdly, a word of thanks, therefore, to the partner institutions who have been so important in helping to help grow this vision of a Centre for Study of History of Catholicism as a key strand of work within the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham, to the University of Notre Dame, Indiana, and in London, to Kathleen, but also to other members of staff in the Departments of History and English within the School of Arts there, to your institution, John, University College Dublin, for your partnership, we so appreciate, and to the Bar Convent, which has been a great continuing story for us. And that leads me so neatly into thanking the religious congregations, without whom any of this work would be, without whom none of this work would be possible, and these evenings would be possible. You have shown insight and wisdom. You've shown concern, and you've shown great trust in us. It has been wonderful. It is being wonderful to be in this living partnership with you, with these living archives. The Congregation for Jesus, the Canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre, the Franciscan Missionaries of Divine Motherhood, the Capuchins of Great Britain, and the Sisters of La Retraite. Each of you has not just opened your doors, you have opened the resource that has enabled postgraduate students, postdoctoral students to engage with that work, to begin to open up its richness. Implicit, therefore, of course, is a word to all the other representatives of congregations. Really think about what it is that you have in your custody, and really think about, this is an invitation to think about what might be possible. It might be that some words of advice from James and colleagues would be helpful. It might be that you have the beginnings of the seeds of an idea of a project. Well, spring, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, is a good time to be thinking of seeds of possibilities. So explore those with James, John, Hannah, and others. And to each and every one who has participated, let us hold this continuing journey in our hearts and thoughts, perhaps as we journey into Holy Week. And thank you. May the blessings of Holy Week and Easter be with you all. And I look forward to engaging again as a humble systematician, touching upon the richness of the Catholic heritage that you're opening up for us. Thank you.